All right, let's just jump right in. We usually get taught that history is this long, straight line of dates and events. But what if that's not the whole story? What if history isn't just some dusty old book, but it's actually a giant laboratory, a collection of huge, real world experiments in how to build, hold, and use power? I mean, if you just look at a timeline, it can feel pretty chaotic, right? One minute we're in Uruk building the first cities, the next we're with the Egyptians raising these massive pyramids for their god kings. Then, bam, we're in China dealing with floods on the Yellow River. Then it's back to Greece and its warrior states, and then over to Persia. It's a lot. It tells us what happened, but it doesn't really connect the dots on why. So here's the big question. What if we're just reading the map all wrong? Let's just throw out the timeline for a second. Instead of organizing everything by when it happened, what if we group these civilizations by the core ideas that were running the show? Let's stop seeing history as a timeline and start seeing it as a collection of blueprints for power. Okay, to see how this works, let's compare two empires that, on the surface, seem like they're on different planets, ancient Egypt and Zhou Dynasty China. Now, both of them claimed that their right to rule came straight from the heavens, but the kind of deal they had with the gods, well, that created two totally different machines for controlling people. And you can see this split right here. In Egypt, the whole game was about eternity. The pharaoh wasn't just a guy who talked to the gods, he was a god, walking around on earth. That made his power absolute and totally unconditional. But in China, the big idea was performance. The emperor wasn't a god, he was more like an agent of heaven, and his power was completely conditional. You could almost think of it like a contract that could be torn up at any time. The Egyptian way of doing things shows this perfectly. Their entire society, from the farmers in the fields to the guys cutting the stone, was basically engineered to do one single thing: make sure the pharaoh lived forever. The pyramids weren't just fancy tombs. They were these massive state-run projects built to launch the god king into the afterlife, which, in their minds, kept the whole universe in balance. Now, contrast that with China's mandate of heaven. This was like a divine performance review. If a ruler wasn't doing a good job, if floods wrecked the harvest or people were starving, it wasn't just seen as bad luck. Nope. It was a sign that heaven had literally withdrawn its support. Power wasn't some eternal birthright. It was something you had to keep earning right here, right now. So let's shift gears and look at our next pairing. What happens when empires are built not on gods, but on the cold, hard logic of law? And here, we get to pit the brutal, in-your-face transparency of Hammurabi's Babylon against the strategic sneakiness of imperial Rome. Over in Mesopotamia, King Hammurabi's famous legal code wasn't trying to make everyone equal. It was designed to do the exact opposite. It was a tool to make the social hierarchy totally permanent and impossible to deny by literally carving it into a giant stone pillar and sticking it in the middle of town for everybody to look at. And the real secret is always in the fine print. This one law tells you everything you need to know. It spells it out right there. A slave's eye is worth a tiny fraction of a free man's. See, the law wasn't about some abstract idea of justice. It was a calculator, designed to put a precise price tag on every single social class, leaving no room for any illusions about equality. Okay, so if Babylon was brutally obvious, Rome, under emperors like Tiberius, was insidiously complex. Power there wasn't just about laws written on a tablet. It was enforced through this massive bureaucracy and, maybe most terrifyingly, a network of professional spies, they called them deleters, who actually got rewarded for turning in suspected traitors. So in Rome, control wasn't just about punishing crimes, it was about turning suspicion itself into a weapon. And that brings us to our next face-off. This is where the real battle isn't fought with swords and shields, but with clashing ideas about what it means to be human. You can think of this next part as a kind of philosophical fighting ring, where these opposing worldviews create completely different societies. So, in one corner, you've got the legalists from China's Qin dynasty. Their core belief? People are fundamentally selfish and greedy, so the only way to keep them in line is with an iron fist, super strict laws, and really, really brutal punishments. And in the other corner, you have the Confucians of the Han dynasty. They believed people were basically good, or at least you could teach them to be good. Their method? Rule by setting a moral example, encouraging respect, and creating social harmony. One of these philosophies built an empire that unified China but completely burned out in 15 years. The other created a system that lasted for 4 centuries. A really similar battle was going on over in the West. In Athens, they believed wisdom came from the crowd. Their biggest fear was the tyranny of a small, powerful elite, so they famously chose a lot of their leaders completely by random lottery. Standing against that idea was the philosopher Plato. He thought wisdom was rare, something that belonged to a small, highly trained group. His biggest fear was the chaos of the mob. He basically thought letting just anyone rule was a recipe for disaster. Plato's whole argument is captured perfectly in his famous analogy about the ship's navigator. To him, the state is like a ship caught in a massive storm. Would you pick your captain by drawing names out of a hat? Of course not. You'd want the person who actually knows how to navigate. It's a powerful argument that ruling is a skill, a real expertise, not some prize to be handed out at random. And you should not make the mistake of thinking this was all just talk. You can draw a straight line from Plato's idea of a philosopher king to his student Aristotle, who then went on to tutor the young man who would put that exact idea into bloody, world-conquering practice, Alexander the Great. An idea that started in a classroom directly fueled one of the biggest empires in history. So we've seen how these core ideas about gods, about laws, about human nature, they all act as blueprints for building power. So now let's look at the actual structures they built. These social pyramids that you see all through history, they're not natural. They are deliberately engineered to serve whatever the ruling idea is. And that leads us to the most important question of all. When you have these systems with millions of people at the bottom, often suffering, what stops them from just rising up and tearing the whole thing down? What's the glue holding it all together? Well, first, let's start thinking about these structures a little differently. They aren't just hierarchies. They're purpose-built machines. The Egyptian pyramid was a machine designed to produce immortality. The Spartan social pyramid was a military machine designed for one thing, to constantly crush its huge slave population, the Helots. And the feudal pyramid? It was basically a protection rocket. And the answer to our question, the secret ingredient, the glue, was spelled out centuries later by a guy named Niccolo Machiavelli. He put it out there with chilling honesty. Love is flimsy, but fear is constant. Fear, he argued, is the most reliable tool you have for control. Fear is the cement that holds the whole pyramid together. Think about it. Why would a medieval peasant put up with giving most of his crops to a lord? It wasn't love. It was because that lord's castle offered protection from a much, much bigger fear, the absolute chaos outside the walls. Viking raiders, Mongol hordes, a brutal, lawless world. The exploitation you knew seemed a whole lot safer than the terror you didn't. So if you were to actually chart out Machiavelli's tools for keeping power, it would look something like this. Love? It's unreliable. A sense of obligation? People can break that promise. But fear? That deep, gut-level dread of punishment or chaos, that is the most powerful and long-lasting political force there is. So when we look back at history through this lens, the ruins of fallen empires stop looking like just failures. They become data points. Every single one is a record of a huge experiment in human control, testing a different theory on how to organize people and get them to obey. And, of course, that leaves us with one last, unavoidable question. If we take the same analytical tool and apply it to our own time, right now, what's the central idea that powers our society? What is our engine actually designed to produce? And maybe the most important question of all, who's sitting in the engineer's seat?